we're going to look at a TED Talk here that's done by Michael Robinson. And it says a theory that you've never heard of, but a lot of us may have. Some of us may have not.
Today, I'm going to be talking about a theory you've never heard of, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll think, as I do, that it really is something that nobody really talks about, and yet it has changed the world and continues to change the world. It's called the Hamitic hypothesis. It's an idea that developed over hundreds of years, became very popular in the 19th century, but continues to affect parts of the world today, particularly Africa. It's the subject of a book that I've written that'll be coming out in a couple of months called The Lost White Tribe, Explorers, Scientists, and a Theory That Changed a Continent. This story, well, I should tell you, I'm a historian of exploration, and that's my job. I look at explorers and expeditions and cultural encounters with people around the world and why people think these expeditions are so important back home. And this story of the Lost White Tribe, which I'm going to be talking about, and the Hamitic hypothesis, really grew out of a book I wrote about 10 years ago called The Coldest Crucible. And that was about Arctic exploration. And in a way, I never would have imagined that this book about the Arctic would have led me to the project I'm working on now, because this book is about the Arctic, and the Hamitic hypothesis is really about Africa. But it actually grew out of part of that earlier topic. I was writing about Arctic exploration. I was particularly interested in American explorers and how in the 1800s American explorers found it so interesting to go to the Arctic, a really dangerous place. Many dozens of Americans lost their lives going there, either to try to find a Northwest Passage or to get to the North Pole. But I found this story of one explorer. His name was Vilhjalmur Stephenson. And he went to the Arctic not to try to get to the North Pole, but to find undiscovered peoples. And while he was in the upper region of Canada, in a place called Victoria Island, he discovered a group of Inuit, which he described when he came back as being blonde, of being what he called blonde Eskimos. And I thought this was the most bizarre story, but I couldn't stop reading about it. There were stories all over the United States at the time. In fact, worldwide press took up the story of the blonde Eskimos of Victoria Island. Some people thought it was a complete fake, that it was a hoax. Other people thought it was an amazing kind of discovery that needed to be explained. But I had nothing that I could do with it. It had no part to play in the story I was telling. So I tucked it away in a file. And what I found was that over the next 6 years or so, I started finding more and more kind of stories of these tribes, these white tribes that people had discovered all over the world.
So let's break in right here. I'm sorry. So what we're looking at is a Hametic hypothesis, but he's saying that he, was first dealing with a lot of these people that were up here in the Arctic and stuff, and you saw the look of that man who had a Swedish type name, but he has very much an Inuit type of look to him. And so he was looking for something perhaps a little more Inuit. You could probably see that in the thoughts. But we went up there, he ran into a people that were blonde, and that blew him away. And of course, once it came out, it blew him away too. But the Mandan Soix over here in America are definitely nomenclatured as having a lot of blondes that were all around into it. And whenever you find out that Pizarro ended up showing up in America, he said that the people in Peru that he originally ran into were light-skinned, fair-haired blondes and so on. And we still see the Wari mummies today that have red hair and blonde hair and things. And so there's a lot of ancient tales of people that have that type of look to them and that are Caucasians all over the place. But if we were to look into the actual statement of Hametic hypothesis, or what Hamites are, and what the division of Caucasian race it would be, you might see something different. The idea that is presented in the Bible, which is where the whole concept of Hamite comes from Ham, which actually is a false thought in the first place. The idea of his fourth son Canaan was supposed to have been cursed somehow, and so Ham wouldn't have been deviated in any way, shape, or form. But people were trying desperately to figure out some way to fit the Bible for everybody in the world, and you can't do it. For the right up in here in the Caucasus Mountains is where you find that the mountains of Ararat are, which you see right here, Mount Ararat. That's where the ark was supposed to come from, and then Caucasians of the Bible had spread out from there. It's a Caucasian book. It doesn't have anything to do with Eskimos or Amerindians or people from South India or Australasians or, Negroids in any way, shape, or form. It's not a book about them. It's the book about Caucasians. And really, we figured out now that it was all about a giant flood that had happened in Mesopotamia, in Sumer, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which was the great flood that they talked about there. And there's been floods all over the world, but that's what they were referring to, and it's even in the Sumerian tablets we found now. So it's kind of where that idea came from. But these were Caucasians, and Noah and his wife and so on. Nowhere in a way could you possibly say, well, all of a sudden they had kids, but one kid was Arabic, one kid was black, one kid was white. And you're like, okay, all right, so where do Asians come from? Well, okay, where did South Indians go? Well, now that we see Australians really aren't related to African Negroids, where does that come from? Well, how about the Amerindians? So, unless you're going to have about 9 people come out of that boat, we're really not going to be able to do that. But then again, 2 Caucasians having kids don't end up having anything but Caucasians, and their genetics are going to be Caucasian, and their phenotyping thing. I mean, it would you might find an oddity or a morph or something weird, but you're not going to find anything that's other than what would be called a Caucasoid coming out of that. And so you can see over here there are all kinds of them. Well, they show that North India is talked about as having these blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. The Tarim Basin mummies that are over here that we talked about. The Ainu in Japan that sometimes Negroids claim. In the Philippines, there was a white set of people and people that are blonde that I haven't done a video about here yet. In New Zealand, the ancient New Zealanders had blonde-haired and red-haired people that were there before, and there's stories about those before the Maori came in, and then of course now the new people that are there, and then when the new people showed up, they go, oh man, these people like you before. So it happens in there. Around in Panama and stuff, there were areas of them that were reported too. Way up here too, that he's talking about, where these people are supposed to have some blondish type hair in. And so you wonder, hey, we're right up here, not far away from Greenland and Iceland and land of the Vikings and stuff, so maybe it spreads out a little more than people thought. And of course, back then, there were a lot of thoughts about things like that, but let's just look real quick at the definition of Caucasian race, if we can, and see if we can't figure out what everybody was talking about and so on, because everybody thinks, Caucasian, maybe they come from the Caucasus Mountains, and that was really like a holotype when they found ancient skeletons. But yet Caucasians, of course, were all over the world. And let's just see where they say. A Caucasian race, or Caucasoid, or Europeoid, is a grouping of human beings historically regarded as a biological taxon, which, depending on which historical race classification used, is usually including some or all of the ancient and modern populations of Europe. And we're familiar with what Europe is over there, all over the top of the Mediterranean, everywhere, except for North Africa, right, down there, and it doesn't contain like Anatolia and so on, and it goes all the way over here. Well, the Western Asia, so it does contain Anatolia, all of Yemen, Sumeria, everywhere over there, up to the Black Sea, around through, and over here to the top of India, but it doesn't show top of India yet. Oh wait, Central Asia, so that's over the top of it and leading up into China. And this, of course, is Tarim Basin mummies and so on, and the pyramids that are found there and stuff that we really don't have access to here, but a lot of people know about them. In fact, a little to the right of there is where that actually is, somewhere right over in here. But then South Asia. So they do include India. But I would like to mention that south part of India has a lot of Denisovan DNA, and you see a lot of dark South Indians. But in North India, you see a whole lot of light-skinned or so on. But in a racial classification, they're a Caucasian or a Caucasoid, even though the dark-skinned one's there. I can show you a picture of a tar black lady in India that has blondish red hair. And so it's just kind of odd, but that can happen out of that in Denisovans, which of course are related to the islanders that you find all the way around through there and so on. And then again, you have an Australian difference that's different and not the same as a Negroid. But then we also have South Asia. We have North Africa. So where are they describing? Well, yeah, if we look there, that's all of North Africa, all the way around to the edge here. And also, yeah, it contains Egypt, of course. And Egypt was always Caucasians too. And then, but it doesn't show the Horn or Ethiopia. Well, hold on, Horn of Africa. So, Horn of Africa, what's that? Oh, that's Ethiopia and the Horn. So, that also was always Caucasians from primordial times. Now, Ethiopia is about a 40 to 50% admix, in some places as high as 50% admix Caucasian. It's why they have a look like that. And I'm wondering if that's how he got that weird Stanley, which he's going to talk about here shortly, has these um, visions that he's talking about other Hamites, and so that was taken into consideration. Everybody loves Stanley and Livingston and Presume and all that type of stuff, so had to be taken into the idea. But what are Hamites? Well, from the biblical Ham, a historical term of the 19th and 20th centuries, talking about ethnology and linguistics for the division of the Caucasian race, related languages to the Berber, Cushitic, and Egyptian branches of Asiatic. Yeah, these Caucasian, Berber, Cushite, and Egyptians. Berber, Cushite, Egyptian, Caucasian race. Right? Okay. So let's continue. Well, let's see. This nomenclature gradually fell out of favor between the 1960s and 1980s, in a large part due to its perceived association with colonial paternalism, which we'll look at in a moment. Populations of Hamitic ancestry stock are now more known as Caucasoid. So it's going to be a Caucasian that we're talking about here. And basically, when we look at a map like this, and we see it basically everywhere that's tan at the time that they do the map here is all Caucasians. And so it shows up through Egypt and around through there. And things are much different now. And of course, there was a late Bantu expansion, and I think that falls into play with what he's going to talk about here in a moment. But there's also, by the way, if you want to talk about Ethiopia, the Ethiopia of the Bible and the Ethiopia of the Greeks is totally different than what we call the country Ethiopia today. For they're even white Ethiopians, yes, you're looking at it, and where their locations are all across North Africa. So Ethiopia is really just a regional concept, and of course it means sunburnt faces, but how can you have a white Ethiopian? Well, you can have pale people that get sunburned, and then you can have other people that are generally staying out in the sun all the time. So let's see, you can take somebody from New York down to a Florida beach and get them out there for a couple of hours, and the next day have them come back out, and you'll have a Florida kid that's been out there all summer. And now you look at the difference of the two, and one of them's kind of a white guy that's sunburnt, and the other one is, maybe a little bit different, I guess. You can get that kind of idea. But then that Ethiopia that we talk about, and if you'll look at this little map, well, let me just go to it because it's not big enough for you to see. But here we see that Ethiopia that they talked about, the Greeks in all their stories, they're all over the place. This is just tanned people. They're even in the Caucasus Mountains. So I guess Ethiopians are Caucasians. Right. They also don't show that Sub Saharan Africa exists at all, and everything that's being referred to here are Caucasian lands that we're referring about here. Caucasian, 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 Caucasian. We looked at every single bit of this under the definition of Caucasian. They didn't really know Negroids existed at this point. The only interaction people had were the Egyptians had some encounters with Nubians. And so to look at things along a current line versus what they used to be is totally different. But remember the Bantu expansion, and we can see that and stuff going on. But yeah, every star that's here are ancient blonde-haired, not even just regular Caucasians, but listed as being blonde-haired people that had happened from there too. And let's go.
So, for example, in Panama, Richard Marsh finds a group that he calls the White Indians. And in Central Asia, there's a group of people who said they found Tibetans who looked Aryan. And in parts of Africa, people were finding white tribes as well. And in Japan, people discovered in the late 19th century a group called the Ainu in the northern island of Japan, which they said looked like Caucasians. So by the time I got to about 2008, I had this giant file of kind of weird white tribe discoveries, and I figured now was the time to do something with it. But there was one story in particular that I was interested in, and that was the story of a discovery that took place in East Africa in the 1870s, in that red box that you see there. It happened just to the west of Lake Victoria, one of the largest lakes in the world, and it was made by a very famous explorer, Henry Morton Stanley. Now, Stanley may be familiar to you as the guy who discovers Livingstone, or rescues Livingstone, in the heart of Africa in 1869. In fact, the phrase "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," was supposedly something that Stanley said to Livingstone when they met. This was one of the most famous expeditions of the 19th century. But Stanley went back to Africa.
Well, they were trying to find the source of the Nile, and he's fixing to go into the idea that Stanley had gone back to do so and to confirm it or whatever, because Livingstone was sitting right there and had pretty much figured it out. But there were other great lakes, Lake Tanganyika and Lake Malawi there that are connected also, and which one runs into the rivers that run into it. He's going to tell you in a minute they find out, yeah, that it's Lake Victoria. And really it is the source of it, but nay, it's not. There's a White Nile and a Blue Nile that run into it, and a bunch of tributaries that end up making it into the larger Nile that it is. Much like the Mississippi. I mean, you can say the source of the Mississippi is way up north and everything, but it doesn't become a big Mississippi River until it gets larger. Or something like the Colorado, which is quite inundated with other rivers running into it that are smaller than it, making it larger and larger and huge, going all the way through. So let's continue.
Africa. He went back many times. And on his subsequent expedition to Africa, he went not to find Livingstone, but to try to discover the source of the Nile. People knew by the late 1800s that there were many lakes in the areas of East Africa, what we call the Rift Valley of East Africa, and that one of these lakes would have been the source of the Nile, something that...
And they kind of plotted out that these ran together and stuff, and if that came down and ran into it, then that would actually be the source of the Nile, and this would be a lake that didn't feed it. There was also the idea it could feed into Turkana, and that could have run in and off of Ethiopia, but they realized that it actually comes off of here, runs through and down, and it actually doesn't connect to these, although these feed out and eventually burp into them, I believe, at a couple of different places whenever they overflow somewhat, which doesn't happen very much, and they all are inundated from other rains. There's a great rift lake here, and there's lots of cool African cichlids that you can get for fish, for home aquariums and stuff that all come out of this area. So
geographers had been searching for 2,000 years. But Stanley said, I'm going to figure out which of these lakes it actually is. And so he treks into East Africa, and he determines with great confidence that Lake Victoria is the ultimate source
God, that keeps
of the
washing
Nile.
out. Sorry.
4,000 miles of Nile River, and that is the source. But what he also discovers is something that, in a sense, creates a new mystery, which is he finds that there are members of an African soldier force that are protecting him, which look white. And he calls them Greeks in white shirts. He can't believe how light-complected these Africans are.
Now, at this time, he's been in Africa for a couple of years and has become swarthy himself. And he's going to mention the fact that maybe he was just so lonely that he started imagining things, probably, and people have taken that as odd conjecture. I think what he's looking at is he's having a bunch of Bantu type, real dark and Nilotic blacks that are around him, and then this light skin admix from long ago population that's there near him. But he actually called them Greeks, which is strange. And what's the oddity there? He goes back on this again later. It becomes his passion to go back and try to, just understand what he was going to do. But let's look into this further.
He asks other members of his expedition party, who are these men? And they say, they come from the mountains to the west on a mountain called Gumbaragara. So he writes about this and sends these reports back home. And the illustrations of his narrative actually show Mount Gumbaragara over on the left-hand side of the illustration. You can see it in the background. This became a huge story back home, this lost white race that Stanley had found.
Now, in the illustration here, you don't see anybody that looks anything other than a Negroid that's with him. And so we wonder what he's talking about. You can tell he's a white man and they're blacks, and that's probably a white man there too. But from this distance, you can't tell. But you don't see anything that looks like what he's probably trying to refer to. Let's continue.
In the heart of Africa. Now, how in God's name would Stanley have explained this in the late 18th century? What kind of theoretical background could people use, or information? Why you would?
Well, people used to try to attach everything to the Bible. This is the burgeoning moment of science where we figured out that the world was a whole lot more than 4,000 years BC old. In fact, they were finding civilizations that go back way further. And you look now, we found Göbekli Tepe, and it triples our dating all the way back, and it shows you people that had a lot more going on. Again, I referred in my videos a lot that I was taught whenever we were a kid that 4000 BC we were Ugg, and it came out of that rapidly and stuff, and now we're finding out those people weren't Ugg at all. In fact, it seems to go back to tens of thousands of years before you could try to refer to people as being Ugg. They seem to be sentient and aware, and the look of Göbekli Tepe, that's not like, hey, last week they came up with astronomy or started paying attention to the stars. You can see it a lot in cave art and things like that. But let's just continue.
Find a group of white people living in the heart of Africa. In fact, Stanley, very much as a man of the 1800s, was at this transition moment between people who used the Bible as a way of explaining the history of the world and people who used science as a way of explaining the history of the world.
See?
And so when Stanley thought about it, he actually looked back to the Middle Ages when people tried to explain the differences that we saw in the peoples of the world, what we would call racial differences, and looked to the stories of Genesis, in particular the story of Noah. And in the story of Noah, we all know about Noah and the flood, but a lot of people don't know what happened after the flood, which was Noah parks the ark on the top of Mount Ararat, disembarks with his family, as well as his three sons, Sem, Japheth, and Ham. And it was really these three sons that many people in the Middle Ages, and by that we're talking about Jews, Christians, and Muslims, all looked at this story as a kind of explanation for how the world got repopulated after it was annihilated in Genesis 9. And
of course, that's, again, the flood story of the Sumerians, and they have it tabulated there where they have Utnapishtim, and the story that goes there, and Enki was the one that had told them to build the boat and do everything. They have the birds like the dove and raven, and they let them free and do everything. The length of time's not the same, but it's because they start using a biblical form of 40 in their deals, and 40 days and 40 nights, and they wandered for 40 years in the desert. That's looked at as being a generational number. It has a significance with doing that type of thing. But so Ham, Shem, and Japheth coming out of the boat, and from Noah, who was said perfect in his generations and so on, then therefore you couldn't have an admix. And if you did have an admix, you'd have nothing but an admix. And so this is nothing but Caucasians coming out of the Caucasus Mountains, and the story of the Caucasians of the Bible that's compiled by Greeks and Romans and things that go all the way through the Middle East here, Phoenicians and everything, and the people that had connected in that time, and the 12 supposed tribes of different nomenclatures of people that fit under that same guise. None of those involved Asiatic Chinese or India or anything, but later they're trying to grip with a sense of the world and see if they can put everybody under a biblical model somehow, and it falls apart, and it should have fallen apart long before, because we found Amerindians and Eskimos and all these type of things. So let's continue. We also knew the world wasn't flat and everything too, which is the biblical model, but the Sumerians showed they knew it was round and had 360 degrees of circumference, and knew that the sun fell 1 degree per day, and so on, all the way down to December 21st, paused for 3 days and came back up, and it did so near a constellation called the Southern Cross, and therefore the ancients said that the Son of God would go down and die December 21st, and then rise 3 days later to save all of mankind from another ice age. Well, let's continue.
as you see here, this is a medieval map showing the three sons of Noah on the three known continents of the world. Asia on the top. You see the little ark there at the very top, hanging out on top of Ararat.
So he's going to talk about it, but I'm going to mention into it more. I don't know if you can see, but this is Ararat, supposedly, in the ark that's on there. And you have Shem, and then you have Ham, and then you have Japheth. So it's kind of twisted. You need to kind of turn your head to the left like a dog hearing a weird noise here. What you have is the Mediterranean, and this is supposed to be Israel somehow. Now, in this map, that'd be wrong because that's supposed to be about here on this mountain. But at the same time, you have these guys going all across here, these guys living in this area all the way to up to India, I guess you'd say, and then all of North Africa. And if you look, just like in that Herodotus map we looked at, they don't know Sub Saharan Africa exists. This all turns into a desert here at the end of it. Back when the Sahara was green, genetics show us that the people that were living there were Caucasians also. And so the admixed people that you see there today is a culmination of what happened much later. And what you see in Ethiopia, which would be about like or something, is also a culmination of something that happens much later. Let's continue.
And Sem, the base of the word Semitic, comes from Sem, Noah's son. And then in the bottom left corner is Europe. This map is rotated east, by the way. On the bottom left, you see Europe, and that's Japheth, the son of Japheth. And then the forerunner of all Africans, people thought, were the descendants of Ham. And so when Stanley...
And they show border mountains down over here, and of course this is coming out, and this would be like your Pillar of Hercules type situation, but this is the size of the world at this point, and if you look, they realize it's round. They're even showing it in an apexing round form, but we're only looking at half of it. Let's continue.
Talks about this white tribe and says somehow they must be related. They must be somehow related to the tribe of Ham, and they became known as Hamites. But this is a transition point. And Stanley was a very smart man. And he was also not just reading his Bible, he was also reading Darwin. And he was reading Charles Lyell, who were beginning to, in a sense, dismantle a kind of biblical history of the world. Guys like Darwin and Lyell said the world was not 6,000 years old. It's hundreds of thousands of years old. They had no idea how old it really was. But it was very, very old. And in addition to that, species maybe didn't stay fixed over time. Maybe species changed over time.
So he was looking at this evolutionary type thing and so on, and people changed over time. Now, this got weird people to believing that somehow going north, black people turned into white people. And of course, that's a falsity, but you still have black people trying to say whites are somehow albino Negroes. No, it's the oddity we're trying to figure out here is the Negro doesn't fit into the equation. Well, neither does the Amerindian, neither do the people out of India, if we think of it on the lines that the Bible talks about. Neither do actually Asians, really, even though they talk about the land of Ophir, and they talk about Sepharad. Well, Sepharad is actually up in Spain in that area there, so that's more Caucasians anyhow. But what you have is a book about Caucasians and the area of the world that they took over, which we're finding out now with the Proto-Indo-Europeans came all the way to China and into there, and I've shown some recent videos of Terran Basin mummies, pyramids, so on. I've got one coming out with a sun circle they found all the way up there also, which is of course an Aryan type thing in a temple that they had, and you could say they didn't stop there. They didn't just stand there and look to the east farther. You don't have to go much farther, you hit there. Recently we found armor in the Philippines that dates to Greeks back to 600 to 800 BC, at least 450 BC, and to that range. And so there's a lot of perhaps merchanting that went on a long, long time ago. But when we talk about Hamites, we're talking about endemic North African, Caucasians, and Egyptians all the way through the Horn at one time. And when we talk about Japhethites, we're talking about northern area people, and Semites you'd probably say were all Middle Eastern, and they go all the way to India also, all the way past Middle East, all the way into what we call India today. And if you look at the Indian crop race, and of course they have this Aryan influx that they really don't like to talk about or mention about. China doesn't want to talk about their pyramids and so on, and black people don't want to talk about what happened to them after all of this even went down, and try to claim that they're the Egyptians and things somehow rather than their West African heritage. But let's continue.
In fact, human beings were once resembled something else. And so Stanley began to try to adopt these old ideas and graft them to new ideas. And a lot of other people at the time did as well. And strangely enough, the Hamitic hypothesis, this idea that all Africans came from the descendants of Ham, that son of Noah, somehow got weirdly flipped to No, Hamites are not all Africans. Hamites are some invasion of white people that happened in the ancient past, and that this invasion of white people explains why we're finding white tribes all over the world. Now, if this sounds a
Well, it's a little bit off the biblical idea of the big diaspora that happened out of that too, but then that wouldn't have been Hamites, supposedly, off of the story that goes there. Although, hey, if the 12 tribes make up those, then how does this work? And the strange thing is that what this time you're in the 1800s and the Bantu expansion had happened and so on, and people really aren't aware of what's going on and how things played out. You can look at things like they found like the Hofmeyer site way down in the Cape that's Caucasians at 40,000 BC. Sure, it's just turning into what we really call a Caucasian today in Cro-Magnon and so on, but modern man, as we call it, with modern genomes, is all the way back to Cro-Magnon days, some 38,000, 36,000 years ago. That genome is still extant today. It's still there. But modern man is actually Homo sapiens. And to make everybody equal on the planet once they were found and so on, you go, okay, we go back to Homo sapiens then. And so Homo sapiens and what they had going on, though, but oddly we found Homo sapiens now since this time 70, 100, 130, 210, 230, 245, 265, and then now 310,000 BC in a North Moroccan cave called Jebel Erud. So there's a lineage of Caucasians that goes way, way back in endemic times, and it looks like that there was a in and out of Africa a few times with an influx. This out of Africa concept, if you're going to say back at, like primates and things, earliest hominids, the earliest hominid we're finding now seems to come out of a European type of area whenever it was totally a rainforest type thing from millions of years ago, actually. In fact, it predates any hominid in North Africa or in Africa itself by over 4 million years, is it? Just did a recent video about it. Anyhow, let's continue.
a little bizarre, let me kind of reinforce this was not some wacky idea like, scientists who go looking for Sasquatch or people trying to prove cold fusion. This was anthropologists, linguists, paleontologists, all kinds of scientists from across the spectrum were interested in this. This is a map, for example, of an anthropologist named Griffith Taylor, who was actually trying to describe what he saw as the racial dispersion of groups out of Asia around the world. Now you'll look
and here's an odd one, but he tries to put everybody not under a biblical model, but he's showing you thousands of years ago here and how things happen, and a ripple that somehow comes out of the center of Asia, saying that this must be where everybody was at during the last ice ages, and therefore because of that, everybody spread out of it. And so this is Asia, and you can tell you got Nordic here. Here's the Mediterranean. So we're looking at Berber and Semitic that are up there, and it runs up into Egypt, but everything turns dark. At this point, there's still no end of Africa necessarily so much. And the Hottentots and the light-colored Negroids that run down to there, this is still not drawn quite correctly, though. And then across to India, and just the bottom of it is darkened people. And Australia out here with darkened people and some of the island people. And so he's saying, well, it's white and it disperses out from there. So what happened here in this old model, he's going to kind of go into it, but I just wanted to say it beforehand so you can understand when he goes, is that there was this reoccurring burp of a volcano coming out here, out of this Kyrgyz type area, and out of that came all the races, and they kept burped out and going, and because the whites were so dominant, it pushed them all to the corners of the earth. Well, that's not necessarily true. We don't find any Negroid stuff anywhere out here. They've always been in there. And if you use the out of Africa theory, they never came out. And so the people that came out changed and did all this type of stuff. So how did people get around over here? Well, that had to be boats anyhow. None of this attaches even at global maximum or glacial maximum and so on. But different people and different tribes and looking things, and Eskimos are a little darker and darker and darker, and they found that, well, Eskimos aren't so advanced, and neither are Aborigines, and neither are Negroids, so the darks are not as advanced as the medium darks, which are third world countries, and then it looks like the whites have pretty good countries going on, and we're discovering the world and discovering sciences and everything else, and now they can fly and went into space. And so it sees a radical difference between the two. but trying to compare it to just skin tone in a way here as opposed to actual racial classifications, and saying that that's how it all happened and everybody was all about evolution. Let's continue.
It kind of looks like a swirly map, but just to orient you here, the middle of the map is Asia. And as you see, there are these kind of initial kind of flows outward of darker races. Now, Griffith Taylor believed that the first races of the human species were primitive, and that the later races of the species were more advanced. And like most 19th century Europeans and North Americans, when they thought about primitive and advanced, they saw it also as a racial ladder, and that primitive meant dark-skinned and advanced meant light-skinned. So they created a kind of color map of the world. To give you another example, he called this the lava flow analogy, that all of the races of the human species emerged first in Asia, and then gradually the later, more advanced races, i.e. the white race, kind of rolled over the other races and spread itself out as it conquered and overcame and drove to the edges the darker raced people.
And so if you look here, it pushed them all the way out. And so the least advanced here are the Negroids, and on the other end of the spectrum, the Papua New Guinea and Australoid type of thing. And as they come in with Melanesians, Melanay, Japanese, Samoan, Tungus, the new Chinese and Northwest Chinese, and then more of an Asiatic that's here, Albanian, Lithuanian, Slavic, Teutonic Greek, Latin Gaelic, Semitic, Hamitic, Bantu, Negro. And so it goes out from there as far as being advanced and not advanced. And so we put it on this type of scale. And so you can see how this in a modern day would be looked at as being, oh, that's racist. Well, in actuality, this is actually reality, that these people were less advanced until just recently, and still show that to this day. They're being helped out by the other Caucasian races quite a bit, and helping to lead them into a modern society. I don't think anybody's going to lie and say that that's anything but that going on at this point still, and it's never going to be looked at as anything other than that. This causes racial tensions, of course, by people that don't like their position, and then they make up lies and cause their own racism by their own hands. And now what we have is people from way out on these edges here trying to come in and live in American societies because they can't get their society going as much, and try to ruin maybe Americans and Caucasian societies with a lot of influx, or people are referring to it as this influx of a lot of immigrants, which they are invited in themselves, and now seems to be an extreme mistake. You can see it in America, and we're trying to build a wall and so on. And there's a reason that one or two or three of these societies have really advanced as much as they have and the others haven't, and it doesn't have anything to do with the color of a skin or necessarily a location. For Caucasians have been all over the place, and it actually is part of what makes it that way in the first place. Let's continue.
Of the world, either intermarrying with them or conquering them. So this was this idea that could somehow explain why you would find white tribes in weird areas. It also happened to fit very nicely with what was happening in the late 19th century, which was new white tribes were taking over other places in the world. Europeans were madly scrambling for colonial possessions from Asia to Africa. In fact, this map of Africa from the late 19th century shows essentially the color codes here are different color codes for European countries. Brown is French.
So brown is French, dark brown is German, so German, German, French Madagascar, French Guyana, French through here, right? All of this being French, basically. French Guinea up here, Ivory Coast. But then you have light and dark colors. Now it says independent state down here in this light avocado color, British in the green. So here's British, 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 British. But then light on Ethiopia, which actually was an independent state. And they're the ones that are most admixed out of everybody. They're 40% admixed and so on. But then there's also Liberia. This is where the Negro Americans were supposed to have gone back to, that America had set up for them as Liberia, and at this point was an independent state. course, we kind of know what's happened there now too. And so the real boundary used to be somewhere around Senegal and north, and then everything that's in the green here was all white or Caucasians, what you would call white now, but Caucasians with a damn good tan all through this area. The closer you get to the equator, which is right in here, you're going to have people that are a lot more tan, just as you see them in America, people living in Florida versus, the Beach Boys versus somebody living up north in, say, Michigan or something. So let's continue.
France, green is Great Britain, blue is Belgium, that purplish color is German. Literally all of Africa had been carved up by European countries as they tried to grab colonies. So the idea that there had been white ancestors who had done this before kind of fit the mode of European thinking at the time. And as European colonists came into these parts of Africa and they looked at various groups of Africans, they said, these are the Hamites, these are these proto-white people. Let's treat them slightly different than these people that we think of as being black African.
And it's not necessarily a slightly different. There were admixed people that were there, and then there were people that were not, and they could also tell the intelligence level of people that they were dealing with and the social level of people they were dealing with. There's a lot of ancient explorers, and it's not just racially, no, they talked about what they were running into and how neat that it was, and finding these people that didn't even know the rest of the world existed and so on. And here we are just a couple of hundred years later trying to cover that up with a bunch of lies. And
so, over the course of the late 19th century, some groups, like the Bahima, the Batutsi of Rwanda, the Nyamwezi of Tanzania, were called white, and other groups were called, like the Bahutu of Rwanda, were called black. Now
that caused problems, because now you have black people fighting amongst themselves because they want to be more white and stuff, and lighter skinned and so on. You can even see it reflected in America, where they're trying to bleach themselves and wear Caucasian hair hats and so on, and they almost discriminate amongst themselves whenever they say, girl, you got that good hair, and ooh, you dark. And so you can see that even happening there. Of course, you're American Negroes are admixed anyhow, and so due to admix, you'll have this pop out every once in a while, and then you have somebody mulatto, one of those that's already admixed, and you can get a lot of variation in that, anywhere from somebody that looks so Beyonce-ish and so on, all the way down to really just still looking more Negro-ish. There's a lot of variation on the theme you can get with that, and whenever you see that also in admixes, when people were coming into Africa, they were realizing that these aren't all the same people. There's so many different variations here. In fact, Africa has the most diverse genetics anywhere in the world. And it's mainly, I guess, because there's a whole lot of Caucasian genetics that are going on in the north part of it. If you took that out of it, though, black people still have no unity whatsoever. There are a lot of variations on a theme. The Khoisan and so on aren't really related to the Hottentot types. Hottentot types aren't related to Nilotics. Nilotics aren't related to any of those. And none of those are related to the West African Negroid and the Bantus. So a lot of variation on the theme that comes out of that. They contain a ghost species too that's like the Neanderthals of the Caucasians, but we can't identify it. It apparently is an elder hominid and not somebody in the Homo genus, but we can't find them yet because we can't find the genetics that match up to it. Let's continue.
Well, at the time, Africans did not have the same idea of racial concept, right? They thought mostly in terms of ethnic or clan terms, and yet these ideas caught on. And it also allowed Europeans and North Americans, when they looked at the great kind of legacy of African civilizations, when they looked, for example, at Great Zimbabwe or the Great Pyramids, they said, clearly black cultures couldn't have created these. These must have been the Hamites, right? Those ancient, highly advanced white invaders who were here thousands of years ago.
And they were right. And Great Zimbabwe, by the way, the people that living there right now tell you that actually white people built it. I made a video about it and the people saying it, and black people get on there and get totally mad. Of course, this is West African people who are trying to say that they are the Egyptians, they were the Hebrews of the Bible, and all kinds of stuff instead of West Africans. So it gets disgusting after a while. And then they just start calling white people Neanderthals and cave apes and things, and say that we weren't around doing anything, we didn't invent anything or anything. It's just, it gets just racially disgusting. So you can see the attitude that comes out of them, and they cause it by their own hands. But no one puts them in check about it, and so it just gets worse and worse, and yet they get these lies going on. What the reality is that Egypt was always Caucasian, and there's blue-eyed, blonde, red-haired mummies that they found all the way through, and genetics says that they're more related to the people up in the Levant and even into Europe during early farmers and so on, and Ethiopians and so on that come through there in the Badarian cultures, and none of that have to do with Negroids. The only Negroid they ran into the time were the Nubians, and they weren't actually allowed into Egypt due to problems they had, and they had a lot of bad things to say about them. But let's continue.
So this Hamitic hypothesis became a way of explaining, justifying white colonization, as well as all of this cool stuff that you find in Africa. And that was a...
Well, how it justified slavery, too, was terrible. They said, oh, well, because he was cursed and everything, and they were supposed to be the servants of servants and everything, so now what we're going to do is we're going to make you our servants and everything off of it. And, of course, the Islamic slave trade started well over 900 years before the Americas were even found, but people want to just mull over that and talk crap about white people in America and British taking over, and all that type of stuff, instead of looking at it as being a humanity finally brought to a primitive land. But let's continue.
Essentially taken away from Africans themselves. There's a very dark side to the Hamitic hypothesis as well, which is this. Even after Europeans left Africa in the 1960s and these countries became independent, even after the Hamitic hypothesis essentially was exploded as not being true, even after that time, Africans themselves had started to adapt and adopt the Hamitic hypothesis as a part of their own history.
Oh, no.
So, for example, the Batutsi of Rwanda consider themselves as having an origin outside of Africa, and other groups in Africa as well. The Iroquois of Tanzania see themselves as having a Mediterranean origin, not an African one. And this racial conflict between the two groups was something that became important in, for example, the Rwandan genocide of 1994. It was much easier for the Hutu to see the Batutsi as foreign, as literally non-African invaders of their own country, and made it...
Because they had adopted the Bible through Muslims and so on, and they saw themselves somehow being attached to Muslims, having a slight admix in them, and then they said, oh, well, these people don't so much, so we want to kick you out, or we just want to kill you off. And they killed a bunch of people off weird in the Bible, and now we're going to reenact that type of thing. It's kind of disgusting nowadays whenever people try to think along these lines. Let's continue.
That much easier for them to exterminate them. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason for the Rwandan genocide, but it was one of the important factors. And so that's the sad part of the story. But there's another part, and I want to end on this other part, which is an interesting part of the story, which is we really haven't actually gotten back to the original question, which was, if these things aren't true, if Stanley wasn't actually seeing white people in the heart of Africa, then what was he seeing? So
I think he was seeing a high admix type of people that had a very light skin, lighter than even the Khoisan that you see probably, that had a lot of alkaline features to them and that looked a lot more like him, like you might find in Beja type people and some of the Sudanese, not the dark, but the lighter Sudanese and so on that were in that area. Some admix people, what you might see as Ethiopians today, but were apparently living around this mountain and so on. And they were so different than the dark Bantus that, and culturally wise too, that he somehow threw them in this other basket, but trying to do so in a biblical model, halfway confused between science and the Bible. Let's continue.
Went to Africa in 2013, and I actually climbed that mountain that Stanley was looking at.
He did this. He climbed it.
Totally unprepared for. I mean, I run. I thought I was in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
But this mountain was 17,000 feet high. There's a glacier on the top of it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really prepared for that. But here I am before I got to that point. And I wanted to see, as I told my guide, I wanted to see what Stanley saw. And my guide, who was a member of the Bakonjo tribe, he looked at me and said, "There's no white people on the top of that mountain."
You can imagine them just shaking their head at him, and they're all packing his stuff in and doing things, and he's come all the way to this mountain and stuff, and then hey, he wants to try to climb this mountain, and they're like, hey man, we don't have to do this maybe because there's no white people up on top of that mountain, man, and stuff. And he goes, yeah, but I just want to see. He's going to tell you, I just want to see what he saw and things onto it. But you can imagine the idea. It's like, no, man, yeah, white people are crazy, huh? Yeah, I'm sure he thought that at the time. But of course, an explorer is trying to figure out what somebody did at one time. You find somebody get up on top of Mount Ararat and start looking around, right? So.
And I said, yeah, I know there aren't, but I want to think about what Stanley saw. And I came up with a provisional hypothesis. And the provisional hypothesis is this. I think Stanley did see difference. I think he did look at people and said, these people do not look anything like these people.
Uh-huh.
We now know that in terms of human diversity, Africa is the most diverse continent in the world.
Sure.
There's more human diversity, i.e. physical diversity in Africa, than any other place, because within Africa is a much longer evolutionary period of time for the human species than outside of it. So I think he did see human difference. And then it was filtered through, and this is my own theory and I'm very proud of it, it filtered what I call the Mr. Magoo hypothesis. So for those of you who are too young to remember Mr. Magoo, he was this Don Quixote-like figure who was so nearsighted that you would stick him in a room and he wouldn't really know where he was, and he thought he was somewhere else. But everything that he bumped into or knocked into, he interpreted as if he was in that other place. Because his expectations of where he was were so strong, it filtered virtually all information coming in. And I think that almost all explorers, probably all tourists, suffer from the Mr. Magoo hypothesis, which is that they too, in a sense, filter everything they see through their expectations of what they should see. And I think Stanley, in a sense, wanted to see people who were like him, who were European. He was a desperately lonely man. He was living in Africa for 3 years oftentimes without anyone else from Europe or North America. And I think in a sense, he wanted to identify with people and saw this difference, cheekbones, aquiline nose, lighter skin color, and traced that as white. And ultimately, to finish it off, why should we remember this strange hypothesis? Okay, it was a kind of inkblot test for the way people looked at the world. But ultimately, I think we should remember the Hamitic hypothesis, because when we think about master races and Aryan domination, we think about the kind of very short, very violent history of Nazi Germany. But in fact, there was a much longer and a much more profound racial theory that continues to exist today, and that is the Hamitic hypothesis. Thanks very much.
And the Hametic hypothesis still kind of lives on today, but it only lives on today in the idea that people can realize that there is a people that kind of heralded mankind and brought forth all kinds of mathematics, modern medicine, and things like that. And it's one group of people that's helped out all the other people on the planet. And of course, they get no respect for it. And right now, I think it's the worst time in history for it, for white man bad. White man bad. Everything he did, white man bad. Even though he's giving billions of dollars a year to help out people in Africa, somehow the African Americans sit over here and try to talk crap about it, even though they're able to live in an air-conditioned environment that they wouldn't be living into if it wasn't for white man bad. They white man bad about it. And like you talked about, they see these features and so on. So whenever black people see a darker skinned person in an Egyptian picture, they try to identify with it, but they don't want to look at the Negroes that are over there that are darker, even, that have the Negro features and the prognostic jaws and things that go with those. And they don't want to look at the real pale skinned women and priests and things that are there. And they always want to look at a worker who might be more tanned in an oxidized paint. And it shows you a grasping towards things, I guess. But in reality, what we're looking at is Hamites, Shemites, and Japhethites are people of the Bible, and they were all Caucasians, and the Caucasians that ended up spreading out across the Middle East, up through North Africa, Egypt, the Horn of Africa, and all of Europe, across through the plains of Russia into China and down through India and always back across. And that's the Caucasian heritage of the world, and certain ones of those have really, really excelled. A lot of others are admixed into that from primordial tribes that weren't actually part of that now, and so you can see some admixing and then some ancient people that weren't a part of that. And that's really my hypothesis, and I think that's the reality of the way things are, that there were primitive people not too long ago on the planet, and there were other people that weren't, and they were observing these things. Now in a modern PC world, we try to hard not look at things under these values, but this definitely is a value system that still goes on to this day, and it's still a problem, an ethnic problem that we find today. And in America, it's become quite a problem because African Americans dissociate themselves with themselves and try to associate with others, and in doing so cause their own racism and then by their own hands, and then they also get mad about the fact that they're not, and so they get this double whammy effect, and then they just want to get mad about it, and they shouldn't look at life with those type of expectations, because again, they're causing it by their own hands and the jealousy that goes with it. And you don't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be like that. I believe Caucasians are trying to help out as much as they can with affirmative action and things like that. It's not going to go any faster with ruining it in the way that it has. But anyhow, guys, I just saw this and I thought I'd touch upon it. Kind of a touching different story to it. Peace.